Hello, welcome to HiveMeet. We are live on YouTube and welcome to our session tonight. Um, I'm going to bring in my co-host, Andrew and Paul.
Here we are.
Hello, Andrew and Paul. Welcome.
Hi.
G'day.
We're going to look at the Varroa map and see how Varroa is advancing in the.
So here we have the map as it is currently, and as you can see, things are hotting up. There's a few more spots on the map now up north, so be assured that Varroa is coming to your hive, and you need to start your mite washing very regularly. Before we progress, I'd also just like to acknowledge our sponsors, 𝖫Qual and 𝖫Trace. We recommend all beekeepers visit the 𝖫Qual and 𝖫Trace websites and consider signing up. There are some special offers available for new sign-ups to 𝖫Trace. And now back to Andrew, who's going to introduce us to tonight's speaker.
Okay, yes, tonight's speaker is Alan Riak from Scotland. I first met Alan about over 10 years ago, and I was even fortunate enough to stay with him at his house in 2017 after the Royal Highland Show in Edinburgh there. Alan is former president of the Scottish Beekeepers Association, and he's the education officer. So that means that he's responsible for their extensive training and certification schemes, and their certification scheme is extremely comprehensive and takes people all the way up to master beekeeping level. So Alan is extremely knowledgeable, and he's ideal to tell us about how to live with Varroa, as they in Scotland have about 30 years of experience in just that. So Alan, welcome, and thank you very much for being here. And over to you and your slides. At the end of your talk, we'll have a question and answer session.
Okay. Well, welcome to everybody to this presentation. And what I've tried to do is to put together a presentation that's fairly concerned with the practical aspects of beekeeping and looking after Varroa. So we'll progress to, I think there might be a way that I can put the slides up, but I don't see it. Oh yes, I've got it. Okay, so since Varroa entered Scotland in the 1990s, it has infected all colonies, bar a few in the Northern and Western Isles, places like Orkney and Shetland and so on. And we've been through the full range of treatments now, from the synthetics to the miticides to the organic acids, and now we're entering the Varroa-resistant queens phase. So that's about where we are. And I'll show you now a slide which shows roughly where Varroa is in Scotland. So this is a map of Scotland from the borders right up to Shetlands up here, just hidden a bit there. Blue is where there is Varroa, and white is kind of mixed. There's some bits free of Varroa and some bits not. And the green areas are free of Varroa. And you'll see a little island here, which is a couple islands called Colonsay and Oronsay. They're free of Varroa, and they are our black bee reserve for Apis mellifera mellifera. Andrew Abrams lives in that area, and he's a black bee specialist. So that gives you a map of where Varroa is. And this is kind of advice from our government. It's a major threat to honeybees in Scotland. We always say there's two threats to honeybees: not feeding them enough for winter and varroa. And it recommends that you contact your local association for advice before moving bees about in Scotland. Regularly monitor, register with a association we have called Bee Base, which is a national bee unit base, and everybody should register with that because they tell you about where disease is present. And the don'ts, well, Colonsay and Oronsay, we mentioned, are currently considered varroa free, and people shouldn't move bees there. And in addition to that, the Orkney Islands are also currently reported to be free. I think up in the Shetland Islands, there only is one beekeeper. He'll be free of that as well. And lots of the other areas are are some varroa and some not. So that's roughly where we're at in Scotland. So what we're going to look at tonight is the mite and its effects, the mite's survival methods. It's a clever beast. Varroa monitoring, most important. Treatment, they'll be different in Australia from the UK, but we can mention them. Varroa-resistant bees, finally. And finally, training, which is all important. So Varroa destructor, what is it? Well, it's a mite, and a mite is part of the arachnids. The arachnids, remember, are the eight-leggers. Insects are six-leggers. And I think we can sum up the arachnids as they're the meat eaters and the blood suckers. All the spiders and mites are into that. So, and here are some varroa with reference to a matchstick. Not many of you may have come across matchsticks any longer. It's not a very good simile, perhaps, but that's a varroa mite anyway. It's a blind mite. It doesn't have eyes, but it's very, very good at pheromone detection. So here's some varroa mite on brood and on bees. So there they are on the bees. And sometimes difficult to see because they kind of hide under the segments of the bee. And here's some on I think this is a drone brood. And what happens after entering the cell? The varroa hides in the bottom of the cell in the pool of brood food, and it uses a snorkel to breathe, its peritrium, and that prevents the bees really from seeing it or from detecting it. So once the cell is sealed, the mother mite makes a hole in the developing bee as a feeding place, and she then starts producing offspring. The first one is a male. It never leaves the cell, and she then produces females. The male mates with the females. They become fully developed females then. And then when the bee emerges from the cell, the mites will be attached to it. And they tend to favor drone cells because the drone takes longer to appear, and that gives the female mite a longer time to produce offspring. So the mite's effect, it was originally thought that really it was just a physical weakening of the bee by sucking its hemolymph, its blood, and devouring its fat bodies, and indeed it does do so. However, by the late 90s, it was seen that the real problem was the mite's ability to spread viruses such as deformed wing virus. That was the real cruncher. Bees are able to deal with naturally occurring amounts of DWV, which always has been around, and because the viruses don't survive going through the bee's digestion system. But when the virus is spread by introduction straight into the hemolymph, it then can take over and produce all sorts of birth defects like deformed wing. So this led to the conclusion that the mite numbers were very important, and a mite calculator was developed. It was a little bit complex to use, people still use it, and an improved online calculator has now been developed, which we'll cover. So we'll show the original one. So you chose your month, and then you chose the number of estimated mites that there would be, and so on, and it gave you a number. But as it says here, it wasn't just the best thing to use, good for resting your coffee cup on, perhaps. But anyway, that's the Varroa calculator that we had up to recently. And the mite's abilities, well, it might be thought that it would have a pretty hard job as an attacker. It's blind after all. However, it is a master in pheromone production and detection. All pests have developed methods which help them survive and reproduce, and masking or mimicry is a favorite method. This is where the pest assumes some of the characteristics of the host, smell being a favorite, and that makes the presence of the mite on an adult bee difficult for sister bees to recognize as something that ought not to be there. It's a case of Sister Betty's developed a lump on her back, poor Betty, but we assume it's part of Betty. So the forager bees and nurse bees, for example, have different odors. So if the mite wants to transfer from one to the other, it must quickly change its mimicry smell, the smell it's giving off, to convince bees that it's part of a bee. And Varroa can produce a new smell in about 3 hours. So they're clever creatures, Varroa. Don't underestimate them. And after all, they have to be clever. Their life depends on it. So, Varroa, monitor, 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 we always say. Up until recently, the danger level was considered to be 1,000 in the active season, and I think on our bee-base site, that's probably still used. But that seems to have been a bit of a misinterpretation of a 2001 paper by Stephen Martin. What the study then found was that between 2,000 and 3,500 mites were capable of transmitting, or mites capable of transmitting deformed wing virus could kill a colony of 30 to 40,000 bees. So in summer, when the worker bee production is high and worker life is short, a colony could even survive up to 12,500 mites. However, this comes down to 2,500 in the autumn, in the fall. These figures are cautious, however, because to kill in a colony, they assume that every mite could transmit DWV virus, which is a bit unlikely. It's unlikely that every mite would be able to transmit that. Now, the simplest and surest method of monitoring is by recording natural mite fall, but other methods can be considered. So mites die, and if you collect the dead as they fall, you can then make an estimate of how many mites are in the colony. The demographers use this when they're estimating human populations, for example. Just count the ones that the numbers that are dying. So the original Varroa calculator was complex to use, and Martin et al. Produced a new web-based calculator, and that takes into account a bit more the state of the colony as well as the time of year. So we'll have a look at that. So this is a view of it. It's a live calculator. So you go in, and with the drop-down menus, you select the relevant details. So what month it is that you're monitoring, the method you're using. For example, it's set here at worker brood infestation. The number of sampled cells of worker brood that you've looked at, it was 100 here. The number of infested cells, the number of these 100 cells that actually were infested, you put that in. and the estimated number of worker brood in a colony. So you have to do a count of that if you're using this method. So you put all of that in to your online calculator, and then you calculate, and out it comes with this answer. For this case, estimated mite population 2,160, so not at a point that you would have to treat. Suggested action, yes, you've got high mite levels, but there's no need to treat, but continue to monitor. So that calculator is hosted on this site here, www. That should be I think, Varroa Resistant UK website, but Andrew will be able to give you the correct address for that anyway. So that would be the calculator that we would tend to recommend using now. Now, this is just telling you what it is. So you've got the drop-down menus, and in this example, it was August. It had an 8% infestation rate of the estimated 15,000 worker brood, and the calculator said that you would have a mite population in that colony of 2,160. So the suggested action was no need to treat at present, but continue to monitor. This is because the current mite population is below 2,500 treatment at this time of year in that size of colony. But you don't need to worry about that. That's all in the background calculation. So that's how the new calculator works. Just a reminder to you of what it is and where it is. And I think that's one that we would recommend using now. So in summary, monitor and don't carry out no-think automatic treatments. That definitely has tended to happen in Scotland, that people go, I think I'd better just treat anyway. Don't do that, because over-treatment with chemicals is bad for bees and bad for the beekeepers' pockets. Drone brood checking is another way you can do a quick check, a quick method of checking, and this is a case of where you use an uncapping fork and take out the drone brood, and then you can count, and you can get a count compared to the number of drone brood that you estimate is in there. So again, go on to this www.varroaresistant.uk calculator. And the only thing I dislike about this is every time I have one of these in my pocket, I end up with about 12 prangs on my thigh, which is not nice. So I developed this method of guarding the uncapping fork. Just get yourself a piece of cork or wood, make a slit in it, and get a tie wrap, drill a hole here and a tie wrap to hold it on, and that'll be much safer to carry around in your pocket than the raw uncapping fork. So monitoring again, so the normal method is to monitor mite drop, and here are two typical mesh floors. So this is one where the floor has been made as a monitor, as a Varroa monitoring floor. And this second one is a much cheaper one, which is just a frame with some mesh. And what you do with that is turn your normal floor upside down and put this very cheap frame on the top of it, and that gives you a monitoring frame at a low cost, and you can still use your normal solid floor. So it's just a cheaper way of achieving. And of course, you need a piece of plastic as a tray to put under the mesh. And the next thing is actually counting what's on your tray. So you'll see all sorts of things in your tray. Here's mature Varroa, reached the end of their life cycle and died. Here are immature ones that have fallen out of cells or off bees. There's little bits of waxy brood cappings, all sorts of things on your tray. And sometimes if your eyesight's not so good, it's difficult to see just what you are seeing. I use a thread counter magnifying glass when I want to get a bit better a look. And when you rest that on the tray, the distance from here to the glass is correct for focus, and then you only have to move your eye compared to the glass to get a good view. These thread counters were used by the textile industry for counting a number of threads in a piece of textile that they were checking. So there's a method that you can use just to check. But you can use just a normal magnifying glass. And I've even seen people take a photograph with their phone and then magnifying the photograph, or you will have on your phone a zoom magnifier built into most phones these days. Now, one thing I found was that on a complete tray, you tended to lose the plot when you were counting. So I made up a very simple tray, just a plywood frame, and some garden binding wires to separate it into strips so that you could count how many Varroa there was in this strip, make a note, then this strip, make a note, then this strip, and so on. And it was a method of counting that just gave you a more accurate figure rather than just your eye wandering about over the tray indiscriminately. So as we said, to calculate the mite loading, use a new calculator. And what about treatments? Well, there are various treatments for Varroa, synthetic pyrethroids and organic acids and thymals, biotechnical methods such as drone trapping. The most comprehensive information we have in the UK is a document on the National Bee Unit site, BeeBase UK, called Managing Varroa. And it's a very valuable document because it's kept up to date, and it's kept up to date with the various treatments that are available. I think it does maybe still quote the 1,000 figure as a danger figure rather than the 2,500 figure, but it's a very valuable document that in our education system we keep referring people to the document Managing Varroa. So aim to use integrated pest management techniques. That's just techniques where you vary the treatments from treatment to treatment or year to year. And that is aimed at preventing Varroa becoming resistant to specific, especially chemical treatments. Treatments such as organic acids, such as oxalic and so on, or thymal-based chemicals, and certainly biotechnical methods, they're less prone to resistance developing in Varroa. But the synthetic pyrethroids resistance will develop. There is a method of checking for resistance. It's a method called the Beltsville test. And again, Andrew can give you a reference to that and how to do it and so on. And we have checked recently for Apistan, for example, and found quite high resistance. The mites are resistant to Apistan in a lot of colonies. So only treat as necessary. In the UK, we can only use treatments approved by the Veterinary Medicines Directorate, and we must record treatments and keep records for 6 years. Because remember, you're putting chemicals into a food-producing environment in a hive, and so you need to keep track of exactly what you're putting in there, and you need to keep records of it so that if there is a problem, we can go back and check as to what went wrong. So this is typical of what you would see in the Managing Varroa booklet I talked about from a national bee unit. This is a table that changes from year to year, depending on what's available. But just very briefly, it gives kind of the treatments that's available to us. So there's a range of thymol-based ones at the top here. And you tend to need a reasonable temperature for them to work. Although I have found in the past that the heat coming off a full colony will actually keep the temperature up high enough that these treatments do work okay. Then we have one based on an organic acid, formic acid. We're a little bit wary of that one. It's very good in that it will penetrate brood cells, which oxalic acid won't. But it tends to be a bit hard on queens. We've found it sometimes puts queens off lay, sometimes permanently. So it's one that we're a little bit wary of, but it is a very useful treatment. You might not use it if the outside temperature was above 30, which doesn't bother us in Scotland very often, but it would bother you maybe. Then we come to the oxalic acids, of which there are a whole lot of proprietary ones. Now, I ought not to say this, of course, but some people just use raw oxalic acid, but they're not supposed to. They're supposed to use one that has been approved by the Veterinary Directorate. And they're used by either trickling, so in solution, they're trickled down between the frames of bees onto the bees, and the bees move about and spread it. Or it can be used by sublimation, where you heat it up and put it into a vapor, and the vapor then goes all through the hive and attacks the varroa in such a way that it kills them but doesn't harm the bees. So they're the two main methods of using oxalic acid. Its downside is the oxalic acid molecule is not good at penetrating the brood cappings. So you tend to have to use it in a broodless period. In Scotland, that works reasonably well for us because we usually have broodless periods in the middle of winter. So treatment in Scotland would often be around Christmas time for us. And that is, or it could be used, for example, after a swarm, because after a swarm had left and you'd collected the swarm would be brood-free for a period. And after a couple of weeks or so, or 3 weeks, the original colony would be brood-free. So you could use it at that sort of time. Then we have a combined formic acid and oxalic acid treatment. And again, we're a little bit wary of the formic acid side of that. And then we have ones based on a very old miticide called Amitraz. Amitraz was developed by the Boots company, the Boots Chemistry Company in Nottingham in 1969, and it was developed as a miticide for, typically, for example, for killing mites in dogs' ears. So it's a very old miticide and still very effective. There's various names for it. Here's some names here that we've got: 𝖫R, for example, and 𝖫TRAZ, I think that one is. These are two that are approved in UK. So that is a treatment still used, and it's not showing much resistance to it so far. It seems to be avoiding mite resistance, but maybe they will get accustomed to it. And then the Apistan, which is one of the synthetic ones, and that we definitely have resistance to. And that is one that you probably will be using as well. There is another one called 𝖫Arol, but that's not approved. It doesn't have a license at the moment in the UK, so that's the reason it's not in that chart. So that's just a list of the sort of treatments that we're using. And as I say, in Scotland, a lot of people would probably be using oxalic acid, one of the oxalic acid derivatives, and they would probably be using it in sublimation form. It's a bit more dangerous to use in that form. By dangerous, I mean it could kill beekeepers. So you just need to be careful with it. Trickling, it's maybe a little bit safer, maybe harder on the bees because it'll be going through their digestion system, but they seem to tolerate that. So that's a kind of an example of the varroa treatments that we'll be using at the minute. And as I say, many Scottish beekeepers will be using oxalic acid in broodless periods, and winter treatments are very common, perhaps too common. A lot of beekeepers are probably using it when the mite loads are not really high enough to justify it. And as I say, either trickled between the frames or by fumigating the hive with vapor. The fumigation method, remember, needs very good personal protection with an acid vapor, an acid gas vapor mask. So just a normal vapor mask is not good enough to deal with the vapor of sublimated oxalic. You need an acid gas mask and robust gloves and so on. And the other thing, of course, is, be sensible, stand upwind of the hive that you're treating so that any vapor that escapes from the hive will go away from you. And the vapor can be created with an electric varroxa, which I'll show later, or with a gas heated one is becoming very common. And we're encouraging beekeepers not to treat unless the load in the hives is too high. That's the only thing I would say about that. So for using a varroxa, an electric varroxa, so this is an electric varroxa, so it's a little frying pan here with an electric element in it. You put your 1 gram or whatever quantity is required of oxalic crystals in there. This part is just to stop it from tipping over. It's just a stabilizer part. And then the stem comes out and then wires go along to a 12-volt power battery. So what I did was I sometimes have to treat for people's WBC hives, which are double-walled hives that we use in Scotland sometimes, and for polyhives. And I found it difficult to put the varroxa in at the entrance of the hive. So I devised this system of treating from the top. So I made up an eek, 35mm deep eek. It's got a little piece of wood that the varroxa rests on with a bit of metal on it to protect the wood, because this gets really hot and can burn wood. And I've got a little door that I use to push it in when it's loaded, and then I shut the door. There's a little slot here for the stem of the varroxa. So you open the pivoting access door here, insert your loaded varroxa, close the access door, put a sealed cover board over, make sure your collection tray is in to seal the bottom of the hive, seal the entrance of the hive with a foam strip, power up the varroxa. Within 3 or 4 minutes, it will have vaporized the oxalic, and the vapor will go all through the hive. People sometimes worry about doing it from the top, but the vapor doesn't care about gravity. The vapor goes everywhere through the hive, so you can easily vaporize from the top. And then 3 minutes after your initial sublimation, the access door is opened, the varroxa is removed, ready for the next one. And I have 1 or 2 of these frames, and so I can go on to the next hive and leave this one sealed up for up to 5 or 6 minutes to let the vapor work. So that's just one method of treating with oxalic vapor sublimation. So we can now move on to the next, what I would say is maybe the next stage of Varroa, managing Varroa, which is breeding Varroa-resistant queens. And this is encouraging the bees to deal with Varroa themselves. So several groups of beekeepers in the UK are now concentrating on producing Varroa-resistant queens, or rather we should say queens able to produce workers capable of dealing with Varroa. Now, honeybees have an extraordinary ability to evolve new genetic traits. This is helped by the fact that they have very high rates of gene crossover during meiosis. This is when eggs being formed. That ability is more than 10 times higher than a lot of animals. We'll just cover that very briefly. What is it? So crossover is kind of a supercharged method of mixing genes, which is good for evolving new traits in animals. So the original chromosome pairs, blue derived from a queen's mother, red from a queen's father. So only one of the bees, 16 pairs of chromosomes is shown here, of course. And at this stage, the two chromosomes have already replicated into a pair of sister chromatids. The chromatids now do a strange thing. They overlap in preparation for this crossing over system. And then here you see the genes have actually crossed over. So some of the offspring will now inherit genes from both grandparents. In other words, it's a method of getting new gene mixes into offspring. It occurs in you, the same as it occurs in the bees. So when your mother's eggs were being formed, when she was inside her mother in the womb, crossover will have occurred on the eggs that were being formed. And then after your mom was born, 20 or 40 years later, these genes, these eggs would be ready for maturation and fertilization. And the crossover links that occurred 20 or 40 years earlier would be in place. So, as I say, it occurs in bees obviously a lot faster, but a lot more it occurs in bees. And it's thought maybe this is because bees live in this very large social unit, which is an ideal environment for the evolution of pests and diseases. And it may therefore be advantageous for the honeybee to run this fast evolution strategy in order to keep ahead of its pathogens. That's kind of the thinking behind why this would be occurring. So, Varroa-resistant queens. We have to be careful. We have to be careful. It's worth looking at a YouTube lecture given by Prof. Martin. You'll see it here, and Andrew can circulate that. And the group that Prof. Martin worked with, the Salford group, they concluded that the queen's biome changes in such a way that she produces hygienic workers. And some of these workers can detect Varroa in cells, somehow by smell. They can smell through the porous cell and think there's something not right there, and they uncap the cells. And then there's some other of the workers have a look in, and they smell the infected pupae and the developing Varroa, and they now pull them out and destroy them, or at least disrupt them. So as we said, bees are good at this biome changes with their high rates of gene shuffling, crossover. And the cell uncapping cannibalization activity doesn't wipe out the Varroa totally necessary, but it disrupts its breeding cycles to the point where numbers don't build up to dangerous levels. So it's now been found that hygienic behavior does not cause workers to remove phoretic out of cell varroa, the cells in the adult bees, from their sisters, because as we said, the varroa has a good way of dealing with that. It pretends to smell like a part of a bee. But anyway, this mimicry is very common among pests in the insect world. But the bees seem to be developing this method of smelling if things are not right. However, being able to accurately determine whether you have resistant queens needs some training. And until you are confident that you have high levels of varroa resistance, continue to treat for varroa. Don't go off saying, "Oh, I don't see much varroa. I must have resistant queens. I don't need to do anything." Be wary of that, and continue to treat until you are sure that you have actually. And one thing I would say is remembering all your bees, because they haven't been subjected to varroa, they will be very innocent of varroa and will be very vulnerable to begin with, I think. Until some resistance starts to build up. So Western beekeepers in England are one of the groups now concentrating on producing varroa-resistant bees, and their chair and education officer, Steve Riley, has produced, which I think is a very worthwhile guidelines in a book called The Honey Bee Solution to Varroa, a Practical Guide for Beekeepers. There are also groups in North Wales and other areas where colonies are surviving with no treatments. Now, this is interesting. The development of these groups has been very much under the radar because up until recently, beekeeping authorities and experts tended to criticize beekeepers that were not treating. And the results were that these beekeepers kept their heads below the parapet. But there's now evidence in the abilities of bees in these groups to develop resistance, and thus there is much more discussion taking place. My local association, Edinburgh and Midlothian Beekeepers, has formed a self-help WhatsApp group to help beekeepers develop resistant bees and to just make sure that they're not stopping treatments for varroa before they actually have resistant queens. So the main feature of these groups is that they accept that we will never have varroa-free colonies, but it should be possible to develop colonies capable of keeping varroa down to levels with which a colony can survive. An interesting thing happened in Cuba when varroa hit Cuba. The Cuban beekeeping had a good system. I think we've lost the, yeah, here we are, we're back. The Cubans had a centralized system, but they didn't have the money for varroa treatments. And so the authorities said, "Sorry guys, we're just going to have to leave you." And there was over 90% wipeout of Cuba's bees. But the 5 to 10% that survived had varroa resistance. They had bees capable of dealing with varroa. And over the past few decades, the Cuban bees have built back up to their normal numbers with resistance built into their biomes. So it does kind of show that it is possible for bees to overcome pests, but you just need to be careful and not lose all your bees during a process. So varroa management, training is very, very important. We always say there's two main causes of colony loss: lack of food for going through winter and varroa. And the second of these, varroa, needs appropriate management and training. and it must be emphasized in all your beekeeping education programs. It's important to train beekeepers on appropriate methods of managing varroa. So the Scottish Government has recently funded a learning booklet and produced by the Scottish Rural Colleges and the Scottish Bee Health Improvement Partnership. And that's available on the Scottish Beekeepers website. Andrew again can circulate that to you. And it's a booklet that just takes you through about dealing with varroa. It's kind of an addition to the bee-based one, and it's various methods of dealing with varroa. So the training is important. So this is a summary of the SBA education system. So here we start with a basic beekeeper, and then you can go through various practical exams and finally become an expert beekeeper. And we also do modules and so on. But at every stage of the SBA education system, varroa management is highlighted at every stage. So when you sit your exam to get your Bee Master certificate, basic certificate, you will be asked about varroa management. And you must do that. So what have we covered? We've covered the mite, its effects on the bee, especially with DWV. The mite survival methods, it's a clever beastie. Varroa monitoring, the treatments we can use. Moving on to varroa-resistant bees, but be careful, and the importance of trading. These are the things that we have covered. I'd like to thank these people for information that I got for this slide presentation. And thank you for your attention. We hope that some of the slides have stimulated some thought and will help you to keep control of varroa when it arrives at your colonies and to enjoy your beekeeping, continue to enjoy your beekeeping. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Alan. That was fantastic. The wealth of experience there dealing with varroa. And you've given me about 5 URLs that I need to put up on the website. So I'll do that so that people can find those videos and references that you've put there.
Thank you.
We've got a number of questions coming in now. So let me put the first one up for you. And that's there. I don't know whether you can read that. Have you any experience with extended release oxalic acid? Here in Australia, we're in the process of registering Aluin Cap, which is one of these extended release strips with oxalic acid in it as its active component.
No, I don't have experience of that. The only strips that we have experience of is the formic acid strips. And as I say, we are a bit wary of that. And I think the other thing I would say about any strips and any extended treatment, I think we need to be just very careful about loading hives with chemicals that are appearing over an extended period of time. That will be hard for the bees to deal with, so we need to be very careful with it. Of course we can do it, but I think we need to be careful with it. And the other thing about putting in strips that I have found, and I found this especially with Apistan amongst beekeepers, they put in the strips and they're supposed to take them out within whatever the period is, 6 weeks or whatever. They would still be in there the following year. So that is just designed to build resistance because the chemical becomes weaker and weaker, which is an excellent method of developing resistance in the varroa mites. So you have to be careful with extended treatments.
Right.
Our next
We,
question comes from Emerald Regional Beekeepers Association. Hopefully you can read that as well, Alan.
yeah, we do sometimes use alcohol or soapy water for counting mites. But I think what I would say is people really find that the simplest is just to do drop counts rather than messing about with any other substances. We would use that if we were doing a Beltsville test, for example, to check for resistance, for mite resistance to chemicals. And again, perhaps Andrew can circulate you some details about the Beltsville test.
Yep.
But other than that, I think the simple methods tend to be best. So the mite drop is a simple method of monitoring, and that tends to be the one that we use. The answer is we don't have a large commercial pollination sector, and I suppose the main pollination activity would be with canola, but farmers are very insistent that putting beehives in canola doesn't have much effect, so they shouldn't pay anything. Of course, they know it does have an effect. It actually enhances the production of canola seeds by maybe 15% or thereabouts. So commercial beekeepers put their bees to the canola, to the edible oilseed rape. We don't tend to use the word canola, unfortunately, in Scotland. We just still use the word oilseed rape. We should be using the word edible oilseed rape or oilseed rape 00. But I think you use the word canola, so you'll know what I'm talking about. And so that would be the main crop that beekeepers go to for pollination, but they don't get any payment for it. They just get the honey. We do have one strange thing that happens with canola when there's now about 18 varieties of canola being grown in Scotland. Not all of them attract bees. My bees didn't go to canola last year at all. They were in the middle of a field of it and they never touched it. This year they went absolutely bonkers on it because it was a different variety. And we see a funny thing happened when they go mad on canola, and this happened this year. You'll know when you're checking for swarms, you look for developing queen cells. And if you don't see any sign of development, you're safe for a week, aren't you? And then you get in and you check it when they go bonkers on the canola, they start producing initial cells from larvae. And I had exactly that. It's the only crop I know where it happens, where it's yielding really strongly. And I had that this year. I'd checked all my hives, not a sign of queen cells. I went in a week later. There were sealed queen cells in 3 hives. The queen was still there in 2 of them, so I could still do artificial swarming. And the queen had gone in the others. That is the only crop when it's yielding really strongly that I see that happening on. But it is a characteristic. And the other thing that happened this year, the crop stopped very abruptly yielding. And for about a week, the bees were as grumpy as get out. And I had all sorts of communications from people saying, well, I've got to replace my queens, Alan. The bees are absolutely terrible to deal with. And I said, leave them a week. That always happens when a strong flow stops quickly. We see it at the heather as well. The bees become really grumpy due to this sudden stop of the flow.
Okay, now, Alan, so far we haven't got deformed wing virus in Australia, thank goodness. But that might make a difference to how destructive Varroa is here. Have you got any comments to make about that? It's
I think,
probably inevitable that we do get it eventually, but for
yes,
the
I think what I would feel about this, because this is what we found here, you do have DWV in Australia, if you look for it carefully enough. But it won't be in quantities that ever cause you deformed wing. So the virus will be there, but because any viruses to get inside a bee would have to go through its digestion system, it'll not be causing any problem. When Varroa starts opening holes in the bee's body and injecting stuff in there, then the deformed wing virus will suddenly get a hold. That would be my feeling, that if you look carefully enough, you're good at analysis in Australia, so if you talk to some of your scientists at the Central University units and ask them to look for deformed wing virus, it would be interesting to know what the results are. But I would guess you do have it, but it's not causing any problem because it can't get into the bee's body.
Yeah, we have had a baseline survey done just this last year, and you're right. There is some deformed wing virus, but it's isolated to the Apis florea outbreak up in far Western Australia, northwestern Australia. So they are reasonably confident at the moment that we don't have it, and that during this first initial phase that we'll be dealing with just Varroa and not Varroa plus deformed wing virus.
Well, that's a blessing. That's a blessing for you
Yeah.
if it doesn't appear, because it is a devastating thing. Of course, you see the bees appearing without wings, and that bee is just worthless, and that's a devastating thing.
Okay.
Another quick question for you there, Alan. Does Scotland or the UK conduct colony loss surveys, sort of related to those presence of diseases? And if so, is Varroa still the primary reason for the colony loss annually?
I would say that with my cynical hat on, it's probably split Varroa and lack of winter feeding. Uh, people admit Varroa, but they don't admit lack of winter feeding. It's what I've tended to find. We do colony loss surveys, and how bad are they? It depends very much on the weather. Of course, we have very variable weather in Scotland. We're blessed by the jet stream bringing all sorts of weather from the west. And I would say that in a year where there's very poor heather, the bee farmers depend quite a lot on heather for bee feed. So when you put bees to the heather, they produce heather for you in the supers, but they also stuff a lot of it into the brood boxes. If it's a poor heather year, then the bee farmers tend to have high losses. And hobby beekeepers as well from that point of view. But more of a problem, I think, amongst hobby beekeepers is just not monitoring for Varroa or using Varroa treatments such as Apistan that are no longer effective. We would tend to consider what's a normal loss. I would think we would consider 10 to 15%. It can in bad years still go up to 30 to 40, but 10 to 15 would not be that unusual for losses. And we keep preaching, at this time of year, make sure your hives have 18 kilograms of food on board. And a lot of hives that I come across, they don't have that. We also use this thing of you should heft your hives. Well, the problem with beekeepers that don't have a lot of experience they don't know what a hefted weight is like, when you lift one side of a hive. So I did devise a simple method of weighing hives, which is on one of the downloads on the Scottish Beekeepers website, just using what I used was just a M6 by a meter long threaded rod with a bend at the bottom and a loop at the top that you put a luggage weigher onto, and you just lift one side of the hive, lift the other side of the hive, add the two together, that's the weight. And we would expect on our hives, which are a bit smaller than your hives, we would like to have a full hive with its roof and everything, food and bees on board, at 28 to 30 kilograms. That's what we'd be looking for. And a lot of hives I come across are nowhere near that, so we do get losses still due to that.
Mhm.
Now, Alan, I've got a question here because in Scotland you've obviously got this brood break, which is very important in keeping the varroa numbers low through the winter and stopping them reproducing. We're not going to get that here in Australia to the same extent, so we're going to have to do brood breaks using queen caging techniques, and that's something we'll do. But I'm interested in the timing of those because I'm wondering whether if you did a brood break during the swarm season, you get a double whammy of keeping the varroa numbers down and also stopping the hive from swarming, or whether you think that would just knock the hive back so much that it never got strong enough to make you any honey.
Well, it's interesting, some of the people that have been doing the resistant queen breeding programs, they are seeing hives that go broodless for periods. It's almost as if the bees are kind of clocked onto that a little bit, that brood breaks, try to stop varroa spreading so much. But the other thing, if you're treating in the swarm season, if a hive swarms, then, and you manage to collect the swarm, or if you're doing artificial swarming, of course, the swarm will be brood free for a period, so you could use oxalic acid.
Sure.
The parent hive that's left producing a new queen, within 2 to 3 weeks, they will be brood free. So you could treat that with oxalic, for example. So there's the opportunity of treating during swarming or during artificial swarming as well. You could do that trick, and I think that's probably as good a way of getting the treatment during brood breaks as there is. It's kind of something that is going to be happening anyway.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether you could use it as a swarm prevention method to as well. That was all.
Yes,
Yeah, got to test
no
it
reason,
out.
no reason why not. Yeah.
Have another quick question from Tony. Do you know why Baverol has not been approved in the UK?
I think there'll be two reasons, maybe, Tony. So one will be that the sales of it were probably going down because of resistance. And the other thing is just the price to get it re-registered. So that is now not unconsequential, if you want to re-register a treatment. So I think these two things will be the things that have caused Baverol not to be used. I don't think there's any other reason that I can think of. Epistan and Baverol both worked very well when they were working. When resistance developed, of course, they stopped working, and I still come across beekeepers that swear by Epistan. When you check their hives for resistance, the varroa are well resistant. So, a treatment that has got Varroa resistance is not a very good treatment at all.
Alan, we've been going for just over an hour now, so I think we better pull this to a close. Thank you very much for your advice, and it's been really useful, and we'd love to see you out here in Australia sometime soon. And thank you once again. And now I think we'll need to move on and just have
Yes, I'm going to do a quick update on developments at the VAA, and it's actually 3 events that we're going to be talking about. The first one is the Melbourne Royal Show. If you don't have plans this weekend, I would encourage you to make time to go to the Melbourne Royal Show and visit the Gourmet Pavilion and Cellar. The VA has our booth again, and we have an amazing array of honeys from all across the state. And in particular, we have the 2025 Grand Champion honey from the Victorian Apiculture competition that was held in Beechworth in June this year. It's a creamed grey box honey. It's absolutely delicious, and we still have a good supply of this at the show. This honey was also sent to Copenhagen, Denmark, and it was the Victorian entry in the honey that was sent to the Appimondia 2025. So it's a very special honey, but we have probably 10 or 12 different varieties. So I encourage you to make some time to go to the Melbourne show. And I quickly want to just recognize the sponsors that were made this show possible. We had sponsors again from all across the state. And we'll be posting this in the Australian Bee Journal and on our website. We encourage you to support these organizations during the year. They have great honey. And if you're looking for great honey this year, this is a place to look for it. And all the links and QR codes are there in the ad. A couple of other events that are happening in October. On Sunday, the 12th of October, the Bendigo Branch Field Day up at the Harcourt Recreational Reserve. This is an amazing day. Great trade stalls, great talks, great opportunity to interact with other beekeepers. And it's a beautiful location. So you can purchase tickets on the VA website. And we look forward to seeing you there. And then up in the Northeast, we've got tutorials, integrated pest management, and more talks and lectures about Varroa. So great to support the NEAA at their field day at Swan Pool Cinema and Tennis Courts. Back to you, Andrew.
Actually, my turn, no problem. So next month we have Mike Allerton reviewing all the latest information about Varroa from his gatherings at Appimonda in Copenhagen. We did a crossover last week, of course, in which we got a bit of a glimpse in some of the interesting concepts and things that are at play, and it'd be great to follow up with Mike and hear more about that. We'd like to thank everyone for participating in HiveMeet, and especially to our guest tonight, Alan, for his excellent insights. It was really tremendous and wonderful to hear your in-depth knowledge of dealing with Varroa. A final word, HiveMeet is supporting Victoria's beekeepers as we build experience and get used to beekeeping with Varroa. That's all for us this month. We'll see you next month. Thank you.